Thanks for coming. I know I stand between you and lunch, so we'll try and get through it. I have a lot of information to share, though, so we'll try and get through it real quick. Real quick about who am I. I know we did a little introduction, but that way, in case I'm a developer experience engineer at LaunchDarkly. If you haven't heard of LaunchDarkly, it's a way to manage feature releases. So it's essentially feature flags, but on steroids kind of thing. So you can manage how you release features and who can see certain features and things like that. And I have written some books and I run a newsletter. And I run this community, cfe.dev. If you ever want to check that out, that actually has a ton of free events all online. So we have a conference coming up in a couple weeks and things like that. So I hope you'll check it out. All right, so let's get down to it. What is the Edge? Well, the Edge's real name is David Howell Evans. He was born in August 1961. He's a lead guitarist, keyboardist, and backing vocalist of U2. Okay, well, I think we're done here. I know this was a little shorter than you expected, but no. In all seriousness, though, before I talk about the Edge, I want to talk about broken promises. As developers, we're often getting sold something that ends up with you get a lot of hype, and then in the end, it doesn't live up to the expectations. And the edge computing has gotten a lot of attention lately, a lot of hype. In many cases, this hype is coming from actually the companies who have a stake in the game, of course. So they're putting out articles telling you how great the Edge is. And serverless in general, I don't know how many of you have a lot of experience, but serverless in general has a history of kind of broken promises. Corey Quinn, who is actually a very strong advocate of serverless, does a lot of work with AWS and does the Last Week in AWS podcast and all that stuff. He wrote this in November of 2021 about different reasons why he felt that serverless didn't live up to its initial promises. I'm a big believer in serverless, but I can't disagree that in some cases it hasn't quite lived up to the initial hype that it received. And the Edge in particular has some baggage that it brings along. So if you can tell from the intro, I am a big believer in the whole Jamstack philosophy of building websites. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Netlify has a lot to do with it, and Phil talked about it a bit as well earlier. The idea behind Jamstack is you deploy these assets to the edge, right? But as Chris Coyer points out in this article, you still need data to run your site, and that data is coming from somewhere other than the edge. That data is probably coming from some region-locked database or data source. For example, if you deploy your site to AWS, you probably have a database that's region-locked to one of their 31 different regions. So I live in Florida. I tend to deploy my stuff on AWS to US East 1. And that would be where, even if the stuff is coming from the CDN, that would be where the data is coming from. So, your traditional model of a website looks something more like this, where you have a user wherever they are in the world, and they get all of their the data and the site assets from whatever server region that's deployed to. Now, when we moved to a model more like a Jamstack model, it ended up something like this, where your assets are actually deployed there to a CDN. So the user gets the static assets very, very quickly. They get the CSS, the HTML, and JavaScript very quickly, but then any data that needs to come from either a database or an API tends to be coming from a single region where it's region locked. So in this case, that would be my US East 1. So if you're all the way across the world, you're still having to traverse all that distance to get your data. Now, Edge functions basically say, let's solve this problem by moving everything closer to the user. So this is something that applies not just to Jamstack sites. This is something you can use on any kind of website. So we bring all the backend processing that was sitting there region locked in that location, we bring that closer to the end user. So the ideal world will look something more like this. This is from the Remix blog. The idea would be that you're the person there, whatever assets you need and whatever data you need will come from whatever CDN is closest to you regionally. So wherever you are in the world, you'll get the closest location for both your, data and compute, and everything would come from that CDN location. So the big promise of Edge from a performance standpoint is that it's going to reduce latency. So does it live up to that promise? I mean, so backend calls do go to the server that's closest to the user. So wherever they are in the world, that will be closer to the user. The thing is that honestly, like, that geographic latency might not be the biggest performance issue in your application, right? It may be other things that are contributing to any kind of performance problems. So, and I'm not like dismissing how big of an impact distance it is. Like in this article basically shows that if your data is trying to travel from US West to Central Asia, it could take up to a few seconds for that to travel, and that could seriously impact your application's performance. So it's legitimate. Like, latency is an issue. Latency caused by distance is an issue, but you have to use the edge properly in order to take advantage of that. So and what do I mean by using properly? Basically, hold on, I got to click back through this. And that's that if your database is still sitting there region locked in some location, whether you're calling it from the edge or not, it's still going to have that latency. So like if my database is sitting in US East 1 and somebody, even if somebody's calling a function that lives over in Japan, when they're in Japan, it's still going to have to call that data all the way across the world. So I can actually still have latency, and I'm going to find that my function doesn't quite perform the way I want it to. In fact, certain scenarios you might actually cause increased latency. And imagine a scenario where my function is calling an API or something, and I call that API, I get the response back, and then I do something with that response that then says, like, oh, I got to call this other data source to get some other information. So now if you're crisscrossing the world that way, you actually increase the amount of latency, whereas if everything was in a single region, you'd cross that only once, right? So the latency issue it's definitely beneficial, and in many cases it can be a huge improvement. But in some cases, you have to think really carefully about how you're going to use it, because of that distance issue may rear its head again. So the other promise about the edge is that it's easy. And I think, more or less it lives up to that promise in the sense that it's just JavaScript in most cases. I mean, some providers allow you to use other languages, but if you know JavaScript, it's just like writing a serverless function, more or less, in JavaScript. So that part, I think, is easy. And there are lots of frameworks that are there to help you as well. One of the trickier parts, though, is that the runtimes are not node-based. So if you're used to working in Node and using tools within NPM and stuff like that, you may not be able to use them in some cases on the edge, because of the runtimes are not generally node-based. And then this is the other thing, is that there are a bunch of providers, and I'm going to tell you a lot about them, but every provider is somewhat unique. They have their own runtime, and so you have to kind of learn the tricks of each runtime to be able to take advantage of it. And so there's like a bit of a learning curve every time if you want to try different providers and things like that. So even trying to decide is often very difficult which provider is going to be the best for you. So the last promise I'm going to discuss of the edge is that it provides you additional capabilities that you wouldn't get out of a traditional serverless function. And you know what? That's actually true. What you can do is you can intercept the response, the request and the response. So that, I think, is really cool, and I'll show you some examples of what you can do with that. And I actually don't have any issues with that. I just think it's great. I have no negatives on this. You should try and do this. So the way this works basically is that the user makes the request, my edge function will intercept that request, and I can actually modify that request at that point. So as an example, maybe the user isn't authenticated, and so rather than going all the way to the my server, I will intercept that and then redirect them at the edge to authenticate at that point, which can save a lot of performance that way. I can actually even just fulfill the response. So like if you've used something called, like Cloudflare has Cloudflare pages and things like that, I can actually, that's how that works. It serves up the response right there. So like if, for instance, if it's a static page, I can actually send back the response right from the edge, which will be, of course, the best performance you can get. But assuming I don't do that, the request can move on to the origin and get fulfilled by whatever server I was running my backend here. And then it comes back and I can intercept it again as it comes back. And this is where there's a lot more fun you can have with this, because you can actually modify the response, modify the HTML, and do lots of really interesting things with it. For example, this Salma Alam-Naylor wrote about how you can use Netlify edge functions to actually intercept that response and make personalization on a static HTML asset. So I could actually serve up a static HTML page, then at the edge, I actually make that page dynamic. So everybody sees something different as if it was a fully dynamic page, but it's actually running static assets. So performance-wise, you have the benefits of it serving static, but I still get the ability to add all this personalization in at the edge. So that is really cool. So some other things you can do with this, with edge functions in general, but like even with this intercepting the request and response, this is one I think is huge, okay? A/B testing, how many of you are doing any kind of A/B testing in your applications? Okay, a couple of you. So typically the way you do this, there's two different options. One is some of the libraries, they're client side. So you often get a little flash of rendering where like something changed as soon as the page load, because JavaScript, it only changed it when the JavaScript ran. The other option is that I do this server side and I serve up different versions of the page to different people. And the problem with that being that if you do any kind of caching of your pages, this can actually impact the way your results work. So overall, like there's a performance hit in either direction. But if you use the edge here, you can actually make those changes at the edge. So your server serves up the same page to everybody, but you make the changes at the edge and handle it there. So you don't get any of that flash of rendering that you would get with the client side, and you don't get the performance issues that you get with server side. So it's a great way to handle A/B testing, and there's a lot of solutions out there now to do it, including LaunchDarkly, but I'm not here to sell you. So you can also update and modify, add custom HTTP headers. For instance, like if you want to add some information about the user, their authentication, or anything like that, you can modify those at the edge. Conditional routing is another one. I kind of mentioned this earlier. Like if the user's not authenticated, I can actually send them somewhere else. Oh, if the user is in this particular region, like let's serve them up a different version of the page, right? It's a good way to handle, for instance, redirects for language. Like if I'm here, I serve up a version of the site from Poland, and then if I'm in the US, I'll get the English version of the site, but all that redirect happens at the edge rather than waiting for either client side or handling that server side. It's much faster. So another one is SEO. I've seen examples of it being used to make some tweaks to the page if it's being hit by a crawler or something like that, so that you can serve up maybe a fully static version of the content or things like that, so that you get better SEO. We talked about this one, user authentication and authorization can happen at the edge, so you can actually do that there before you go back to the origin server, save you a lot of time, and it'll be much, much faster. IoT and gaming is a kind of a specialized use case for the edge. This is actually one of the first use cases you saw using the edge heavily for compute, which is basically because that those milliseconds are extremely important in those, for in a game or an IoT. So it's very important to use the edge there. And we talked a little bit about this personalization. So I can add personalization at the edge, serve everybody up the same version of the page, but then add some personalization at the edge. One, a common thing you often see when you go to a site is you're logged in, but it doesn't, you see that flash of rendering of things changing because you logged in, instead of saying, hi Brian, it'll have the login button, and then as soon as the page finishes loading, the JavaScript runs and it'll say, oh, hi Brian, instead of login, right? Those kind of things you can handle at the edge. You don't get that flash of rendering that you would get with JavaScript, right? So you can add all those little personalization bits at the edge and save on that performance, and your site will function better. And then the last one is compliance-related stuff. So I can inject HTML, for instance, at the edge to say if I'm here in Europe, I can actually inject the footer or the cookie footer that you don't need in some other countries, or anything else like that, where you might have compliance issues with local laws or other things. You can do that at the edge. So one little side note before you get all excited and you're oh, I'm going to throw everything at the edge because it sounds so amazing. There are a number of limitations on edge functions that you don't get on a typical serverless function. So the amount of code, the kind of kilobytes of code you can include. There's tighter limits on execution time for them. The amount of memory you can use is also much less than a typical serverless function, and the amount of time that it's allowed to respond is very limited. The idea is that an edge function has to run extremely quickly. So all of these things are very limited because you don't want, the whole point is not to really impact the performance of the page. So you don't want it basically running for 3 seconds at the edge, running a whole bunch of things. So there's very strict limits on those kind of things. So you can't really move everything over to the edge. I don't think that's the point. So I hope that gives you a kind of gist of what edge functions are, why you might want to use them, and what you can do with them. So now I want to talk to you about some of the actual options for using it in your application. So there are a lot of offerings out there. I've tried to group them in a logical way for you, and I've come up with kind of these 3 different groups of edge function offerings. One is what I call core edge serverless. Basically, these are CDN providers that have added compute at the edge. So all of these, you might recognize some of them, Cloudflare, obviously, Fastly, Akamai, were all well-known CDN providers. They've added compute at the edge and then packaged that up as an offering that you can use to run serverless edge functions. Dino Deploy is another one, if you've ever used Dino, which is it's like Node, but different. It's not Node, but similar. They have their deploy option that they sell as well. AWS has a couple of different options we'll talk about a little bit more. This is definitely not a full list. There's a lot more providers out there, but these are some of the more well-known ones. We'll talk about some of them as well. But basically, these are the kind of, they own the CDNs, so other providers also build on top of that. And so that's where I get to what I call edge platforms, which is there are other providers who are building on top of those core edge serverless to make it easier for you to use. Okay, so Netlify Edge Functions is one we talked about. Netlify Edge Functions under the covers is Dino. Vercel's Edge Functions under the covers is Cloudflare. Supabase is also Dino. Cloudflare also has their own way of doing this, which is called Cloudflare Pages Functions, which you can use with Cloudflare Pages. Obviously, that uses Cloudflare's workers. Each of these kind of makes it easier for you to deploy edge functions without having to go directly through the core serverless provider. One thing to know is that they're not always identical to the offering of the particular provider. So like Vercel's edge functions only don't deploy the same number of regions, and I think Netlify's edge functions right now don't actually have Dino added a KV store for key value data, and that's not implemented yet. So it's not an exact match of the provider that they're doing, but the point is they make it easier to implement. So then there are, like, outside of the actual providers, there's a bunch of frameworks that also make it easy to add edge functions to your applications. Next.js has a whole layer. They have basically edge functions, and then they have what they call middleware, which is middleware is that intercepting the request response. So the typical edge function in a Next.js application will be like fulfilling the full serverless like function at the edge, and then the middleware is intercepting it, the request and response. Astro, which is one of my favorites, has like Netlify SSR integration for the edge. SvelteKit has some examples as well for Vercel and Netlify. Levany has a plugin that works on just Netlify. Remix has adapters for a bunch of the providers. And Fresh is a framework that's built by Dino, so obviously works on Dino deploy quite well. So those are just some of the frameworks. Most of the frameworks now today have started to add in edge support as well. So we talked a little bit about that you need your data at the edge, right? Like, so how do you manage that? If you need to access data at the edge, there's a whole bunch of providers who are now moving data to the edge. Like this, so most edge providers provide a key value store, which you can store certain types of data in. But if you need a full database, these are like mostly full databases here that like running MySQL at the edge. And the way this is done is actually, it's a little bit not exactly what you expect. It's not like the entire database running at the edge. It's read-only database at the edge, and then the writes are centrally located. So my write, like it's in the example before, my read would be wherever the user is. Like if they're in Japan, it would be in Japan. They'd be able to read the data that way. But if they're writing to the database, it's going to be like in my server in US East 1, right? So that kind of thing. But that'll make it, the performance will be great, brings your data close to the edge, and you will see a lot of the benefits from that. But one thing to be aware of is that in most cases, these are eventually consistent, and what that means is that it's not going to be like, because it's replicated across all of these nodes across the globe, that takes some time. So you'll see that in basically any kind of data you do at the edge. For instance, I did a lot of work with Cloudflare workers. It's well hidden in Cloudflare workers. It can take up to 3 seconds to see that replication for the KV store happen globally. So you'll sometimes be sitting there and like, why is this not working? You just give it a couple seconds and then suddenly the data will show up because it has to replicate across all these nodes across the globe. So you have to, it's not that important, it's usually minimal, but it's something worth knowing. If you are interested more in edge databases, this is a good article by Lee Robinson on all of the state of all of the database offerings, because it's a really, really fast-moving area. These are mostly brand new offerings, so and it's changing pretty quickly. So I want to go a little bit into some of these providers to kind of give you a sense of how this stuff actually works and what it looks like. So I talked first about Cloudflare workers. It's hard to see that map, but that's actually, Cloudflare has probably the most CDN locations of any of the providers for this stuff. So that is a map of all of their CDN locations across the globe that your data could get replicated to. So workers are deployed using a CLI tool called Wrangler. So you have to download their CLI to actually create and deploy workers. The nice thing is that it gives you a really easy way to test them locally as well. They run on this runtime that Cloudflare created called Workerd. It's a very strange name for the runtime, but it allows you to create this in JavaScript or WASM. So typical Cloudflare worker might look like something like this. This obviously doesn't do very much, but I have to add an event listener for the fetch event, which basically handles getting the incoming request, and then I can fulfill that request using the handle request method. In this case, this entire, this function would actually fulfill the request. You'd hit the function and it would send back hello world. It would not go on to the origin server at all. This is fulfilling the entire request right here. But that's almost every Cloudflare worker ends up looking like this. You have that fetch method that you catch the incoming request or the outgoing response and you make modifications. So they also offer something called Cloudflare Pages Functions, which, as I said earlier, makes it a little bit easier to deploy these things. So you can automatically add workers to a Cloudflare Pages site, which you can build using almost any framework. And these are built the same as workers. The way that works is basically I add a functions. This is a Cloudflare Pages applications. I'll add a functions directory, and I might have like an API that has all of my edge functions. And then I can do things like, I can do dynamic paths and stuff like that. So there's a catch-all root at path as an example, or username as a dynamic username variable that I can pass down into my worker and things like that. So kind of typical, if you've used other frameworks, is a typical way of creating these kind of paths for an API or whatever it is you're building there. So one of the most interesting things about Cloudflare, though, to me is because I've been talking a lot about needing to put your data at the edge, they have a ton of data offerings at the edge. So you have your key value store, the typical key value data. You have something called durable objects, which basically it's a data storage for object data. This is only available, that one's only available on the paid accounts, so you have to have like a full account with them to be able to use durable objects, but it's a neat way of storing objects at the edge that are then replicated. R2 is another one that you can pay as you go, but it's an S3 compatible object storage. D1 is their most recent offering. It's basically a SQL database at the edge. Again, replicates reads all across the globe, but writes centrally. And that one's still in alpha. I wanted to show you real quick. Let's see if I can swap here what a real Cloudflare worker looks like, as opposed to that simple one. In this particular case, it's not showing. Why is it not showing? I apologize. Let's see. That's because I need to move this here somehow. All right, that's not going to work. All right, I apologize. I cannot show you. Oh. There we go. It is working. I just have to this is like 2 monitors. So, okay, now we can see it, but it's not large enough. There we go. All right. Can you all see that all right? Yeah, okay. So in this case, I'm doing some interesting things here. I'm using, I'm actually using LaunchDarkly's SDK as well here, but the interesting things I want to point out to you here is that, let's see if I can scroll down. Come on, scroll. So I have my handler here. It's actually using the KV for some data storage. So I'm getting assets from the KV. I'm also doing things like I'm modifying the response here. So Cloudflare provides this thing called HTML rewriter. And the HTML rewriter allows you to modify the HTML. So it's like, it works kind of like your typical selectors where you can say, oh, select H1 or select anything with this class like you would your CSS selectors. And then I can modify the response. So in this case, I apologize, it's a little wonky here, trying to get this to work on the screen here. But in this case, I'm actually doing a couple things using those injectors. One is that I'm injecting JavaScript. So in this case, I'm typically like LaunchDarkly would load up and then have to call out to get the flags, right? All the flag data from our edge servers. But in this case, I'm actually injecting that flag data right into the script. So you can imagine doing this with any kind of JavaScript that you need to, like you'd want to inject at the edge. That way, it doesn't even ever have to call out. This is updated automatically. It's always the most latest flag data, and it loads up without any, delay. It's like immediate. The other thing I'm doing is that I'm actually modifying the response I'm getting. Like if it finds an H1, I'm going to modify that H1 and add in some header text based on, like this could be like your A/B test where I'm going to modify the text of an H1 there. All right, let's see if I can go back to this. That worked. All right. So next I want to talk about real quickly Deno deploy. So Deno deploy has 35 different regions. They now added a KV, which to me was a big missing piece because you could not do any kind of data storage at the edge before. So the KV uses SQLite, and it doesn't replicate across all of their regions, but it replicates across many of them. They support JSX out of the box, so that it's actually a good way to have your server response for like a React application. You can serve up JSX right there. It is also not node-based, it's Deno-based, but Deno does support a ton of NPM modules, so you can use many of your tools in Deno deploy, but you might not be able to use all of them. So I will quickly just show you what this would look like. We're back here. This is, all right. This is a Deno deploy version of us doing something similar. In this case, because it doesn't actually provide me straight out of the box like things to modify the HTML, but I can actually import libraries. Like I imported this linked DOM parser to be able to get the DOM and modify it. So you can see I'm using that DOM parser to then modify this HTML response here. And it's just, again, it's just JavaScript. It looks very much like Node. There's not a lot of like, there's not a lot of differences between using Node and Deno, just some slight differences. And in this case, I'm also calling out to an API to get some data and modify the response as well. So again, just quickly give you an idea of what that actually looks like. I do want to quickly go over AWS because, well, in most serverless things, AWS is the monster that like this. They are the king. They have the most market share, and but with edge functions, it's a little bit different. There's two offerings. I find them a little bit confusing, to be honest, but there's Lambda at edge, which actually doesn't replicate to as many regions. It's only replicated across their 13 regional edge caches, which may be perfectly fine for you. The benefit of Lambda at edge, the thing that makes it great, is that it's the same as Lambda, basically. You can do almost you basically take your Lambda function and you deploy it to the edge. So like if you know how to make a Lambda in AWS, you know how to make a Lambda edge function. There's not any real learning curve. There are other limitations to it, so you have to be aware of that. But you can use your NPM tools and all that stuff. You can deploy it in whatever languages AWS supports, which is quite a few. So there's all those benefits. Then there's something called CloudFront functions. This is actually replicated to 218 edge locations, but it is extremely, extremely limited. You can only do very specific things with this, like you can change headers and redirects and things like that, but that's it. You're done. That's as far as you can go. So it does replicate to many more places, but it doesn't have as many capabilities. If you want to understand the differences between the two, this article helped me a ton to understand that. It talks about CloudFront functions, but it also tells you the differences between Lambda at edge and CloudFront functions. So one of the last ones I want to talk about is Netlify edge functions. And so as we talked about before, Netlify is more of like a platform for it that builds on top of another provider. So Netlify is built on top of Deno. Basically, it's really easy to add functions. It's kind of like the Cloudflare Pages functions. You can add a directory, and that directory will get deployed to the edge. So you can create your API at the edge. They give you geolocation information, so that could be a way that you do your redirects or make modifications. They also have something they call Next.js Advanced Middleware that includes special tools for modifying content and the headers if you're doing applications in Next.js. As I mentioned, this is built on Dino. Right now, as I also mentioned earlier, but I'll repeat it, they don't have the KV support yet. I'm going to assume it's coming, but they don't have support for the KV, so you can't do any data at the edge. And this is what that looks like. Guess what? If you looked at the Dino example earlier, and you look at this, you're like, this look exactly the same. You know, basically, they are, because it's Dino, and I'm doing exactly the same things using Netlify Edge functions, and it works the same. So last thing, Versal also has Versal middleware and Edge functions. So again, middleware is the intercepting, the request and the response. The Edge functions would be like putting your API at the edge. So they work on Cloudflare workers, but they support only 18 regions. Edge functions they're just like your typical your serverless function, except you just kind of tell it that this is going to be at the edge. You just define that in the function itself, and that tells Vercel to deploy that to the edge. They do have like KV, blob, and edge config for if you want to store data at the edge as well. As I mentioned, middleware will run on every request and response. And just like the other one, like Netlify, they do have built-in geolocation and IP information, which can help you do some cool things. And if you're curious, like if you do use LaunchDarkly at all, we actually do have a LaunchDarkly and Vercel integration that will sync that flag data to the edge. So that's basically it. I have posted in a GitHub repo, like basically all the slides from this. It's a different version of the slides because I had to change it to PowerPoint for here, but it has exactly the same data. So if you want any of those links or any of that info, you can actually get it from there, as well as when I originally researched this was a few months ago, so some stuff has changed, but I have all of my research in different documents for each provider, so you can see like all the details of that as well. I see somebody has, okay, you got it. All right. So with that, I'm done, and I'm open to any questions.
Are there any questions? Do you have a question? There's no question in Slido. Maybe you can ask in person.
Yeah, it's all right. I know I threw a lot of information at you. So, all right. Well, if you think of questions later, I am here. I'm happy to chat with you about it, as well as you can find me on Mastodon, or you can email me. I'm happy to answer your questions there as well. Thank you.